The original version of this video was uploaded to Jason Verney's YouTube channel, where it and many other videos, podcasts, snippets and films can be found. That channel can be found at youtube.com/Jason Verney.
This is the No So Copo with Jay and Tim.
I am Jason Verney.
And I am Timothy Holm.
In this podcast series, we talk to one another and sometimes with special guests about
what we know about Korea,
what we don't know about Korea,
what we want to know about Korea,
and occasionally what we don't want to know about Korea. Recording live from UK's Koreatown itself, that's an area in and around New Malden, that's the largest Koreatown and Korean community in Europe. We'll start this episode off with a quick summary of what we've been up to in the last few days, but as well as that, we'll just cover one or two bits of news, which we normally do at the end of the show. So, Tim, anything special you've been up to?
Not too much in the past few days. I've been taking a rest a little bit because we had a holiday here on Monday.
Yeah.
And, things seem to be a bit quiet around here these days, but, I have actually signed a contract for a translation job, but I won't mention specifically what it is
That's
until
good.
It's officially started. But it is a fairly big thing, and I look forward to doing some more work on that soon. And I will let you know more about it when I can. Yeah.
Yes, interesting. Yeah. You have told me about that, so it is exciting. I can confirm that, but I won't. My lips are sealed
Right.
as well.
Thank you. And I don't know if you heard about this, but since this is the 9th episode of our podcast.
Yeah.
On September 9th, which is also 9/9, there is a holiday in North Korea, and this is called the Day of the Foundation of the Republic, which is essentially North Korea's Independence Day. And I didn't really know about it, but I just happened to look it up earlier.
This week.
So yeah, have you heard about it?
I hadn't, no, not that particular date. And I mean, they do have some interesting names of their celebratory days, I guess. But
right, because South Korea just recently had their Independence Day, which was on August 15th, which they celebrate every year. And I was surprised because I assumed that North Korea would also celebrate the same day because technically the Korean Peninsula was liberated, on August 15th.
Yeah.
So, but it seems as though North Korea has their own unique Independence Day.
Talking about the 15th of August, you probably saw, or I'm talking to you, Tim, and the audience,
Yeah.
you might have seen the KBCE. They're kind of promoting the Harvest Festival, which we have mentioned before, coming up next month. Oh, sorry, later this month.
Yeah.
But they also have mentioned on their posters, haven't they, the Independence Day?
Yeah, it was interesting they mentioned on there, because at first I was a bit confused. I thought, why aren't they having it on the Independence Day? But, yeah, they want to incorporate, I suppose, some celebrations because they didn't have a chance to celebrate it in August.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
So as I said earlier, we're going to combine, just because we've got a big interview this week. This is our third interview that we're broadcasting.
Yeah.
And this particular one is quite long. It's a two-parter, but you're going to hear the first part. But because of that, we want to just get our sort of usual show stuff out the way first.
Yeah. So, Jason, you wanted to mention something about a short film?
Yeah, not my short film, because I've mentioned that in a few episodes, which, although this is the same length, this is a film it's an old film, I think it's several years old, it might even be 10 years old. It's a film by Bora Kim. Now, she is known for the big success that is House of Hummingbird. It did really well in the awards and did very well
Yeah, it's a lovely film. I saw it at the one of the film festivals in London a couple of years ago before the pandemic happened, and yeah, it's very sad, but it's a really well-made film.
Yeah, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because her mid-length film from all those years ago that is called The Recorder Exam, and it's actually on Mubi.com, and they're a
Right.
really good platform for independent movies, art house movies, but also they have big blockbuster films, and I was just surprised to find it on there. So, have you seen it, Tim? You haven't
Not
yet.
yet, but yeah, I have a free trial. I think, or not a free trial, but a 3 month trial, which
Cheapo.
was
Yeah,
one quid, only 1 GBP,
yeah, they do.
so very cheap.
That's right, they do. Mubi, I've been following Mubi for many years, and they've always done good deals. You can have a 7-day free membership, 1 month or 3 months, or even three for £1. I think it's 3 months for a
Right,
pound.
right.
And I just wanted to mention it because I haven't seen it anywhere. I've been dying to see it, or at least wanted to see it, and it's a really good film. I can say that. I mean, it's 30 minutes. It's very. You could say it's very similar to House of Hummingbird. It's regarding. Well, it's called the Recorder Exam, so of course
Yeah.
it's regarding children,
Right.
but it's told in her sort of unique way.
So the recorder being the musical instrument.
Yes, not. It is set in the 80s. It's set in. Is it 88 when the Olympics was happening? But it's around that time. But no,
Right.
it isn't. Yes, it's the recorder, as in the flute-like thing that we have.
Right.
So that was the thing I was going to talk about, because we all seem to be talking about Korean film lately. There's a bit of local news to mention here in New Malden, Koreatown, and that is that a couple of doors along from the Seoul Plaza, that's the Korea Foods company, which is just near the Waitrose on the High Street. There's two of them, but and there's also a giant Korea Foods as well, tucked away. But 2 doors or so along from that, there's a new tea place opening up. Now, it seems to be Korean. I've seen Korean people doing the place up. It's called an Antique Korean. I can't remember the exact name they're saying, but it's coming soon. It's having a grand opening day soon. And yeah, it looks interesting. I mean, because we have got also a dreaded Starbucks coming. So this is interesting to see one of these coming.
So it's gonna have like antique furniture and stuff inside or something.
Yeah, I can't make that out whether it is that or antique cups and things. Clean, of course.
Right. It sounds like it might be a little bit similar to Choice Cafe, which is on Kingston Road in New Malden.
That's the nearest one that springs to mind. Myself and Tim were discussing this earlier on when we found out about it. But it used to be a little travel shop. I forgot the name of it, but it's just before you get to Haru, which is a great little eatery, and before you get to the place, another coffee shop. But yeah, so it'd be interesting to see what comes, or how exclusive it is, and how it competes with I'm 99% sure it is a Korean business.
Yeah, there seems to be more and more of these Korean cafes popping up these days.
And I think that's good. It might be that there's, people say there's too many, but the one good thing it is doing, a bit like 63 High Street, the good thing is it's keeping the Koreanness of the place as well. It's keeping the... It's,
even if it is sort of westernized style, right?
TT as well,
Yeah.
And we've just got one. We've got to get into the interview, but we've got one bit of news which has kind of affected the whole world. This is the situation in Afghanistan,
right?
And while the UK have committed to some refugees to take here, other countries are doing, in my opinion, doing a much better job than what we are, and we can do better, and we are semi-responsible for the things that happen there. But the interesting bit of news, I don't know if you want to go over this, is regarding Korea and that situation.
Well, apparently, so South Korea has agreed to accept a certain amount of refugees from Afghanistan. I think it's like a few hundred.
Yeah.
And but the thing is, they're not actually calling them refugees. They're calling them something like
merit or something.
Persons of special merit or something like that. So, and actually, the vast majority of these people are those who worked for the South Korean embassy or in the military or the government, right, in Afghanistan, and their families. So it's not just random citizens from Afghanistan. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad that they're not taking more refugees, but at the same time, they know that in Korea, refugees are not seen in a very positive way, unfortunately.
On the other side of things, it could lead to them doing that or something potentially, or do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I hope that they get settled properly and that people in Korea accept them and are welcoming to them, but you never know for sure, right?
Yeah, it's still, we've said this before, homogenous society, and there's other political reasons. But yeah, we just thought we'd mention that because that's a bit of news that we were very interested in.
Yeah.
So let's get into the main aspect of this show, and that's the interview. Now, a bit of background about Hanguk Hapa. She's also known as Becky, by the way. She does have a real name. But we got to know her through her social media, essentially. And if you follow Korean-related events or restaurants or Korean-related stylings and hanbok or beauty, you might have seen her already.
Yeah, the first time that we met her, was that for the hanbok event that we worked on? No,
just before that.
Yeah, before that. We did the rice cooking video and washing video. So she was involved with that. She did the intro and outro, and she did some of the interview and tasting for that video with us. And yeah, as you mentioned, we had already seen her before online through social media and stuff, so it was just like a matter of time before we met up with her.
She seems to be everywhere on social media, which is, a good thing. She's got a YouTube channel. She's gonna talk about this.
Yeah.
She's a half Korean, hence her name relates to that. But we'll let her explain that.
Yeah.
But one other thing relating to that rice. Thinking about it, she did what you can do with that rice. Also, what some Koreans do is actually wash their face with it. So she did a sort of a diary on her Instagram and elsewhere about how that was going. So that might still be out there to be able to catch.
Yeah, you're talking about the leftover rice water from after washing the rice.
Oh yes, and I don't mean physically putting rice on the face. Right. I'm not saying that wouldn't work because I'm no expert.
You never know.
But
so, and also while we did this interview recently with her, which will be split into 2 separate interviews. She also interviewed us briefly for her Instagram, at least, and so that should be coming out soon. I'm not sure exactly when, but maybe in the next week or 2. And look out for that if you want to see our answers to some of her questions.
It could be that she's doing that as we speak, but on social media it could appear today even. But it could be another few days. So I think that's all covered about her. We'll leave you to listen to the first part of the interview with Hanguk Hapa.
We hope you find it interesting. Thanks.
It's Jay and Tim. We are doing our latest interview, and that is with a person called Hanguk Hapa. Yeah, so here we are in a lovely little eatery in New Malden, and apologies for the noise, but we're going to basically turn you over to an introduction from Becky herself.
Thank you for introducing me. So I'm Becky, a half Korean, half English blogger on a mission to promote real authentic Korean food and the history behind it. And on my socials, I'm known as Hanguk Hapa, Hanguk meaning Korea, and Hapa, which is a word that I discovered is from Hawaii, and it's to describe someone of mixed ancestry. And I chose this word because it doesn't have negative connotations to describe someone of a mixed heritage. So thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah,
it's our pleasure.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So, my first question is maybe just if you can tell us a little bit about your background. Like, you're obviously half Korean and half British, and so when did you sort of start getting more involved with Korean culture, and how was it growing up in Britain as a half Korean?
Okay, I'll answer the first part first. So my mother is South Korean and my father is English, and they met here when my mum came here to study. And I was born in the UK. I was born in Surrey, which the area where I grew up, there weren't many Koreans. So my exposure to the Korean community was only via my mum and my mum's family. And I would say I got more into my Korean side the older I got, because as a child I didn't like my heritage, and I think it may have been because I wasn't really around many children that looked like me, and I wanted to aspire to look like my friends who were English, white English. So yeah, it took me a long time to be proud of my Korean side, but through research, through living out there, and through actually just talking to my mum and being honest with her of how I felt as a child, really helped me be proud of both my sides.
Okay, so thanks for that. So you mentioned growing up, and you mentioned going to school, and it was a mixed school, and I wondered if there was any sort of issues, not only fitting in, but with any sort of racial remarks or sort of issues with that.
Yeah, so the school that I went to, which was an infant school, so it's from aged 4 to 7, this school was predominantly white English, and actually there were hardly any other children of any other background. So of course children were interested in me because they'd probably never seen someone that looks like me, and as a child I was quite dark, so they would say things about my eyes, or they used to call me brown girl because I was really, really dark as a child. But also they did say things to other children as well. Like if someone wore glasses, they called them four eyes. If someone had different coloured hair, it's kind of the nature of children. But for me, it affected me because I so wanted to be seen as British, as English, because my dad's English, I was born here, I speak English, and I couldn't understand why I wasn't perceived that way. So when I'd go home, I would often say to my mum, like, why does no one see me how I want to be seen? And I did often say to my mum, I don't like being half Korean. So when she tried to teach me Korean as a child, I just refused. I just said, no, this is not my language. And now I deeply regret that, because if I had learnt so young, I'd be so fluent now. But it's something that I'm still working on.
Okay. Yeah, and thanks again. It's interesting that you were trying to fit in as British then, and now you're trying to do the opposite, which is, well, trying to promote Korean culture and the sort of authenticness. Well, I did hear that you had, from another podcast actually, that you did have a sort of situation where when you were taken to a school by your mother, it was that didn't go so well, but then you were taken by your dad, who is of course British. Could you just elaborate a bit on that?
So this was the same school that I stayed at, where I did experience some children remarking on how I looked. And so the school was very close to my home, so we were in the catchment area, and my mum went and asked if there was a space, and they said no, there's no spaces. But there were no other schools nearby, and we really wanted to go to this particular school. But then a week later, when I went with my dad and he asked if there was a space, there was a space. And it may have been that a space opened up within a week, but I do believe, because at that time when I was a child within Surrey, there really weren't many there weren't many people from other countries in the area, so I think there was a bit of tension and people perhaps not understanding. So I think it affected my mum more than me because I was too young to really understand. But yeah, we have experienced some things like that in the area, but now that it's more multicultural, it's not as often as it was.
So, I mean, we could say that's possibly a subtle form of racism or discrimination, but have you experienced any more overt forms of racism living in the UK as a half-Korean person?
Sometimes the opposite. Like, sometimes, not necessarily the opposite, but sometimes people innocently may ask, you speak English really well, where did you learn to speak English? And it confuses me because there's so many other nationalities that are born and bred here, but I feel when people see an Asian face, they assume that they've come here to study or to work. So that kind of annoys me when people say that. And sometimes, because my name is very English, sometimes people assume I have some quote-unquote exotic name, and then when I say my name, they assume it's not my name as well, because I've got my father's surname, which is an English surname. So those things sometimes annoy me, but not to the point where I feel like I've been racially attacked. But there was actually an incident a few weeks ago where I was with my mum and someone just came up to us and asked if we ate dog. And
you mentioned it on social media or something.
Yeah, I was so shocked about it. I did put it up because it was so uncalled for, and I think it just comes with ignorance and not really being exposed to different cultures. But for me, I think witnessing how people treat my mum, when I've seen how she's been treated, like by people that may speak to her slow or may assume she doesn't know something when actually she speaks English really well and she understands a lot more. That's what really upsets me, because she doesn't have the language to convey how she feels, and because I can't speak Korean, she can't explain to me in her own language, and I don't like seeing sometimes how people treat her.
Right. So then, on the reverse side of things, when you actually went to Korea to work for, was it 1 year?
Yeah, it was about 1 year. Yeah.
So did you also experience any forms of discrimination there, maybe in a different kind of way?
Yeah. Firstly, because I can't speak Korean properly, so despite me being half Korean, I wasn't really accepted as a Korean person because I can't speak Korean, which I understand, but I really, really wanted to fit in. And I did pick the language up quite a lot when I was out there, but I didn't like being referred to as Honyo, which means, in Korean it translates as being half Korean, because actually the words used actually means to be half-blooded. And then, so when people referred to me as that, I felt like, well, I'm not half-blooded, I'm just half English, half Korean. And sometimes people would call me that and then I would feel outcasted. And even when I was there, I had an alien registration card, and just the fact that in Korea they refer to foreigners as aliens, I found that really strange, because it's like they want you to feel othered, and it's like if you're not ethnically Korean, then you're not a part of our society. But I think it was just a bit of a culture shock for me, because we don't do that in the UK.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So, also leading on from what Tim just said about fitting in Korea. Now, we know people who are sort of British or American, and they've got Korean wives in Korea, and they've had babies, so they are now halfies.
Yeah.
I wanted to know just a little bit about when you were there, how you sort of went in finding if there were any others. So bearing in mind this was a few years ago, if there were any other halfies or half Koreans in Seoul or anywhere in Korea.
Yeah, so I was working in a school, and the school I was working at was in Chuncheon, which is not the capital of Korea. But I made that decision because I wanted to experience the countryside of Korea, and I knew I can just get a train, the KTX, into Seoul. But actually after a few weeks I was quite lonely in Chuncheon because I only had my co-workers, and I wanted to make friends. So at the time Facebook was like the most used social platform, and I just typed in like half Koreans in Korea, and then I found a group and I joined it, and then the organizer messaged me and said we've got a meetup in Seoul. So I went there and I met other half Koreans from all over. Some were like half British, half Korean. A lot were half Korean, half American, and
Russian.
like there were some half Korean, half Russian, Brazilian, European, and it just felt really strange to be amongst so many other Hapas because like I've only really been exposed to a few in the UK, and I just thought, wow, we're all like halfies and we all have experienced similar things even though we've lived different lives. We all know kind of what it feels like to want to be accepted but not because we're not fully Korean.
Yeah, that does sound a bit like the adoptees from Korea, you know, how they must feel, want to go back to Korea and be accepted, you know, like Busan babies and all those. That does sound a bit similar to that.
Have you seen the film Soul Searching?
No.
Yeah, it's more about, I guess, adoptees, Korea, or gyopos, you know, who come back to Korea, and they sort of get together in a group, and they all have slightly different experiences, but also some similarities between them. So it's quite an interesting film if you have a chance to watch it.
It's by Benson Lee, and I think he's American Korean. He definitely lives in America, but he made it, and it's almost like there's a classic Hollywood film called The Breakfast Club, which it's kind of a parody, or it's done in that way, but it relates to, as you just said, Koreans as opposed to Americans, and it's just really good because it kind of revisits Korea, and as Tim said.
Anyway, so you mentioned that you didn't know that many I don't know if the correct word is halfies. I don't want to be, sorry. But, so you didn't know too many when you were growing up. Do you know more of them nowadays? And do you still keep in touch with any of the ones that you met in Korea?
Yeah, I knew about 2 half Korean, half British families through Korean church, because we met at church. But after going to Korea, meeting more half Koreans, of course I came back to the UK. Lots of them stayed there because they enjoyed doing like teaching in Hagwon, and it's a really nice kind of life if you enjoy that kind of thing. But and actually some of them came back to the UK as well, so I do keep in contact with them, and but they're all kind of scattered around the world. But that's why social media is such a great thing, because I can still not always talk to them, but at least see what they're up to in life, and it's nice, yeah.
So going back to fitting in, or not fitting in, but going back to your early years, and at school, being at school. Now, did you, with your love of food that you have now, Korean food, and this is maybe a sort of strange question, but a bit more light-hearted. You know, did you have school friends that you would take back to your mum and dad's home, and you would introduce them to Korean cooking or cuisine? I wondered if that was something you would do. Did it ever happen?
Gosh, I'm really going back now. I think the only friends I invited round my house, even as a child, were ones who befriended me for who I am, as opposed to like commenting on how I look or how different we are in complexion. So those kind of friends, instinctively, I knew as a child I could trust to take to my house. So I think a few times I did expose some of my close friends to my mum's cooking, and actually all of them now love kimchi.
Oh wow! Okay.
Like they have a really good acute sense of what good kimchi is, because my mum makes it so well. But if I need to take, I don't know, like school lunches on a school trip or something, I specifically would say to my mum, please just give me sandwiches. And it's not so much like because I was ashamed of the food, but Korean food is more pungent and it does smell more. And if you're on a coach and you're taking kimchi or something like fishy, then it is going to smell. And I just didn't want to deal with people saying, oh, what's that? I just wanted to eat in peace. So that's something I always ask my mum to do.
Okay, well, it's good that you have those friends even now. It sounds like you still have those friends, which is nice, because it doesn't always happen with school and people growing up.
Yeah, so at what point did you sort of become aware of the fact that Korea is divided into two Koreas, and then that the North Korean culture is very different from the South Korean culture, and eventually maybe did you also know about Chinese Koreans, and did your mom talk about those kind of things with you when you were growing up, or is this something that you learned about later by yourself?
Well, because my mum's brother, which is my uncle, my samchun, is a 목사님, so a Korean pastor, we often had North Korean and Chinese Koreans in our church, because there are so many churches, Korean churches in like New Malden and the surrounding areas, because it kind of works as a hub for the community. Like, yes, it's a service if you believe in God, but it's so much more than that, because it's how you find out about other Koreans and you get connected. So I was exposed at quite a young age. I didn't really know much, but if I told people I'm half Korean, they would always say it from North or South, and then I kind of started to realize, there's a divide. So my mum did tell me about the war, because she was born just after the war, the Korean War. So she told me what Korea was like after the war, and then that made me research myself when I was a bit older into the history of Korea, because my mum always said to me, if you can't understand where you're from if you don't know the history of both sides. And of course at school we learned British history, but there was no avenue for me to learn Korean history, so I kind of just did it myself.
Yes, it's important to learn about your heritage, anyone's heritage really, as much as I tend to not want to know too much about the British, but they must be I'm interested in the Korean. But leading on from what Tim said about the North and the South Koreans, or they're just Koreans basically, but in the community that we're in now, in New Malden or the surrounding areas of New Malden, there's probably meant to be about 600 or so North Koreans, and there's also 300 or so. These are estimates elsewhere in the country. But I wondered, when you come to New Malden, do you ever two things really. One is about the Korean sort of diaspora and how you feel being half Korean. Do you get that? Firstly, do you get the urge to come to Koreatown to for the food, or because the feeling you get here? Is there something like being in Korea, but it's slightly more accepting here perhaps because it's British, not so homogenous? But also what your interest or passion is for trying to know more about the North and the South here in New Malden, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Two-part.
Yeah, that's a really good question actually, because when I started off this Hanguk Hapa food stuff, I was really adamant that I want to stick to New Malden, because New Malden is known as Koreatown, and these businesses are often family run, and they often just put in their life savings just to support their family and for their children to have an education here. And there's so many food bloggers in London that I feel kind of the Korean food in London is already sorted for people promoting it. And my experience of Korean food in London is that it's not as authentic as the Korean food you get here, but that's to be expected because they have to adapt to the palates of who comes into central London. I mean, I do sometimes visit London and try some places, but when I started my YouTube, I wanted to just stick to New Malden and try and promote New Malden as being the Koreatown. And actually, when I was at university, my dissertation was on the Korean settlement in New Malden, and even at that young age, I really felt like there hasn't been much research done, but Koreans have made such a difference in the borough of Kingston that maybe something needs to be written or something needs to be said. And one of the people I interviewed for my dissertation was a North Korean refugee, and it was the first time I'd really met a North Korean not through the church. And what really struck me was when we went for the interview, he was still very private, and we went I think it was Yumi restaurant, we went to one of the back rooms, and because I can't speak Korean so well, my mum translated, but what came across which shocked me, because I didn't really know, was that even though there's South Koreans, there's North Koreans, there's Chinese Koreans in New Malden, and North Koreans come here as refugees to make a better living, that sometimes they still feel that they are looked down upon by the other Koreans here. And that kind of upset me, because I thought, well, we should all be working together to help one another. And so what I wanted to do with my YouTube content is to bring that more to the forefront, because I feel if you come to New Malden, then yes, we may all look similar, but there are differences between the different Koreans. And when people think of Korea, they only think of South Korean culture, and there's more to it than that. It's not just about K-pop and barbecue and K-fried chicken. There's so much more that should be exposed, and there's not really anyone doing it except us, I'd say.
Yeah, a few people, yeah. Well,
yeah.
One more thing, leading on from that, actually, a couple of things you mentioned there. I mean, for example, the Korean Cultural Centre, London, KCC UK, they heavily promote Korea, of course,
Yeah.
but it's South Korean flag,
Yeah.
and it's South Korea. Of course, there's all these politics at play, and it's just a shame that it's not. There's not some. I know there was a Korean in this community, Bona Shin, and she tried to get some events to bring the Koreans together. And it's a shame that it's not. I mean, even KBCE, they want to do something like that, but it's not. It's still, at this point, it's still not enough. But another thing you mentioned about there's some looking down upon of North Koreans or even Chinese Koreans or Korean Chinese, and there's also, from what I've heard, there's certain restaurants that are owned by one of those, like Chinese Korean or Korean, but they just won't. South Koreans won't go there.
Yeah.
Or they know that the chef is North Korean, so they might not go there, and even Chinese Korean. So it's, even places where we are right now, I'm not sure of the history of the owners, but there could be people that don't come here because it's heavily one way or the other. It's very south or it's very north or whatever. So that's quite interesting. We hope something can be done about that.
So that was like a full menu of interesting tidbits, wasn't it, Jason?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, she's certainly, she calls herself a foodie, but she's so much more than that. And how ironic and apt that we chose, between the three of us, we chose to meet in an eatery, and we've mentioned this place before, which Tim might elaborate on the place, but it's just down the road from where we are right now.
Yeah, Cham Doshirak, which is a Korean place that basically they're most famous for serving lunch boxes and kimbap.
Yeah.
Which is what we ate that particular day. Kimbap is one of the most common like snack foods in Korea. Some people would call it like a Korean sushi, but of course there is difference in it.
Yeah,
it's not exactly the same as sushi.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she talked in this interview. She talks a lot about food, but also about her home. So not home life, but her home. Her mother, her father.
Yeah. She
talks about being a halfie, a hapa, and so many other things. And she's a vlogger, YouTube. I think she might say blogger, but maybe she also does that. But or it could be pronunciation. The V and the B in Korean are very similar as well, although she's still getting to her Korean roots.
And she will talk more about that in the next part of the interview, which we will be scheduling for 2 weeks from now. At least we hope to have it on available in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it should be. We should be ready in 2 weeks. So yeah, she's got so much to say. We had so much to ask. We didn't even complete the. Even though this is only a first part, there's so much more we could have asked her. But she's sort of living Korea and learning Korea, and she's been to Korea, but she's and she's very enthusiastic. That's the thing.
And I mean, we have even considered having her on as a more regular guest at some point in the future if people respond well to this interview.
Yeah.
And speaking of responding to this interview, we do want to say thank you to people who have responded to our questions from last week.
Yeah, or anyone who is still in the process of doing so. We haven't set a date when we're going to give that feedback or when we're going to decide on what irrespective of what we get feedback, we might still make decisions anyway, as we mentioned in the last episode. If you don't know what we're talking about, that's episode 8, and that was 8 questions we had for our listeners. So
so we're still collecting the feedback, but we of course appreciate every comment, and if you do make any more comments in the future, we will be doing our best to respond to each and every one of them.
And we might even read 1 or 2 out on the show. We don't have to include your name if you don't want, but we're quite happy to do that, as we have once or twice before. So we've kind of condensed the show mostly into the first part, which was before the interview. And so really we're just going to play out now with the final part of the show, which is the music. So lost in the words then. And so you're going to hear a bit from Kaya, the band, the duo Kaya. It's new Arirang from their album Korean Breeze. And that's it.
Right, see you next week, Jason.
Yep. See you, Tim.
And 안녕히
계세요.